Okay, Unit 1, Chapter 2, Improving Personal and Organizational Communications. Does my use of social media impact my ability to communicate effectively? So that's a question we should really be asking ourselves. So when we look at this chapter, these are the 5 objectives. 1 is understanding the communication process. 2 is identifying filters that can get in the way of communication or enhance it. Identify ways to improve personal communication, good listening skills, how communications flow throughout an organization, several different ways that happens, and then learn how to communicate more effectively using both social media and other communication technologies. So when we look at communication, just because you're not good at it now doesn't mean you can't get better at it later. And so Steve Jobs gave a commencement speech at Stanford. And in this speech, he goes through a number of different things. But essentially, one of the things that happened is because of his lack of communication skills, he ended up getting fired from Apple. And in this commencement speech, he goes on to talk about how that really helped him find himself a little bit more and then develop his communication skills. And so, one of the key messages coming out of this is that we really need to do a good job of finding our own voice, learning how to communicate that, but also at the same time be able to listen to others so that we can grow as people. One of the things that we see with today's technology is that our attention is more divided than ever. Um, we have the ability to access information instantaneously from anywhere and around the world. We can text our friends, our parents, whatever, and instantaneously that message is delivered. And the real danger in today's world is that once that phone pings or beeps or buzzes or vibrate, whatever the heck you have it doing, we immediately need to look at it. And the problem with that is that it is distracting us from everything else that we need to be doing. And the fact of the matter is that we cannot multitask. We cannot be texting and driving. We can't be texting, watching videos, TVs, listening to music, and concentrating on reading a text. Our brains just can't work that way. And so really what it does is it breaks down our ability to communicate because we can't concentrate long enough to both deliver a message and receive a message. When we look at communication process, there's 2 different types that take place. You have impersonal ones, which is basically one way. When you're given instructions, when you're given policies, when you're simply given data, that information is flowing in one direction, and there is not a back and forth that takes place. Interpersonal is when 2 or more people are communicating with each other and there's back and forth. In order for interpersonal communication to really be effective, there needs to be some kind of feedback. So in other words, if you're talking to your friend and they're expressionless, they don't ask any questions, it's almost like you're talking to a brick wall. So effective communication requires a back and forth between people. When we look at the simple way that this works is you have a sender who delivers a message, the person receives that message and gives some kind of feedback back that yes, I heard what you had to say. In all reality though, this process is far more complex because you have the sender who has a whole host of filters that the message goes through. Then you get the message that has to go through a whole nother set of filters of the receiver, and that is going to impact how that message is both sent, received. So a good example of this is sarcasm. The sender can have a verbal message that doesn't match the nonverbal. And that is going to provide a filter that makes it harder for the receiver to know exactly what is going on. And that can impact the feedback as well because the receiver then has these filters and the feedback goes through that filter and then it goes through the sender's filter. And so this can be a messy process. So some of the key communication filters. One is semantics. And so this cartoon does a good job of expressing what semantics is. When you look at that middle panel, she says, what is the difference? Well, there's two different meanings of difference. There is the difference between two numbers, and then there is the difference of, not liking tomatoes. And so that can be a communication filter that's going to cause problems. So there's several ways that you can overcome these language and cultural barriers. One is to learn about the places that you're going to or about the people who come from these different areas so that you can kind of begin to understand how maybe some of these differences could get in the way. Two, show understanding, show interest, display that you're willing to overcome these language and cultural barriers. And also, you need to have a belief in yourself that you can do this, that this is worthwhile, and that you are competent enough to be able to overcome these. So let's look at just some of the different ways that language and cultural barriers can get in the way. I noticed this a long time ago when my cousins from Texas would come and visit Iowa. And when we were talking about getting something to drink, one of the first moments where I kind of noticed this language difference is when I asked one of my cousins what they wanted to drink. They said Coke, so I brought them a Coca-Cola. And my cousin said, no, I wanted a 7-Up. Well, in Iowa, we refer to pop, and then we say the specific kind of pop that we want. However, when you look at this graphic, you can see in the South, they refer to all kinds of soft drinks as Coke. In California, they refer to it as soda. And so you can really see how specific this is, even by counties in states, the way they refer to soft drinks. Another way is with hand expressions. So when you look at this, and this comes from the book, these different expressions or nonverbal expressions can mean different things. So you can see what this means in Egypt, in Italy, and in Greece. And so you can see where those cultural barriers can get into the way of things. So the book has this little section about learning to speak Iowan. And so here's this little meme that can kind of show how these communication barriers can break down, because in different parts of the states in the United States and the world, we kind of have our own situation, our own unique perspective that influences or our points of reference, I guess. Another factor is emotions. Emotions can really be difficult filters to overcome because if we're unable to detach ourselves from our feelings, it's really going to impact how we interpret messages and also how we send messages. One of the things that we need to kind of learn or keep in mind is that when we're dealing with people in states of high emotion, don't respond to the emotion, pay attention to the content of the message and respond to the content of the message. The other thing that's important to realize is that when we look at this in terms of both selling maybe ourselves but also in working in the world of work, if someone has a positive experience, on average we'll tell 4 to 6 people. If we have a negative experience, so for example, if you go to a restaurant and you have terrible service or terrible food, you're more likely to tell 12 to 16 people. So when you look at that, a negative experience is going to spread word more rapidly and further than a positive one. So it's something to kind of keep in mind. The other thing is that attitudes can get in the way. We tend to become a little resistant. So if we have a preconceived idea about someone because of where they come from, what they believe, what they've said in the past, we're really resistant to kind of communicate very effectively with them. Role expectations are another thing that get into our way. If we link a person too closely to their role, we are less likely to kind of pay attention to the message. So for example, kids a lot of times will tune parents out, but they'll listen to someone else who's maybe saying the same message because we tend to identify our parents with with not maybe knowing as much as what they should know or whatever. But sometimes our understanding and viewing our parents as parents first, not as people, gets in the way. The other thing that can get in the way is if someone changes new roles. So, for example, in the world of work, if one of your coworkers becomes your boss, sometimes that begins to hinder our communication because we no longer see them as our coworker. We see them as our boss, and we associate that role with being a boss more so than our former coworker. The other thing is roles as positions of power is going to really impact the fact that maybe we view a principal as being in a position of power, therefore we aren't going to communicate with them because we don't feel like maybe they'll listen to us. Others are gender specific. These learned gender roles can get in the way. And when we look at nonverbal messages, one of the key things to understand is that about 35% of communication is verbal, 65% is nonverbal. So we have to really be aware of the tone of our voice, our facial expression, the way we're standing, eye contact, all of those types of things. Because if we want to effectively communicate our message, our nonverbal needs to match what our verbal message is, or else there's going to be miscommunication. Emotions and attitudes. The moment that emotions take over, our brain turns into fight or flight mode. And the reason that this is important is the reasoning part of our brain shuts off when that happens. That was because of survival. So when we're dealing with someone who is, again, highly emotional, they're upset, or they have a very strong negative attitude, no matter how well-reasoned, logical, correct you might be, it doesn't matter. They're not going to listen. They're just shut down. So keep in mind that that is not a good time to try and continue to communicate. And this is going to happen in the world of work and in offices and dealing with customers. So you just need to kind of keep that in mind. When you look at semantics and language, again, like for example, when I took the coding class and they started talking about hexadecimal and binary numbers, that was a foreign language to me, and it really got in the way of my understanding of what was happening the first few weeks. Some examples of culture in Bettendorf, where I taught previously, it was kind of two very different worlds. You had the people who lived in poverty, and you had the people who lived in pretty extreme wealth. There really wasn't much in between. So it was interesting to have those two different kind of socioeconomic cultures in the classroom at the same time. And some of the nonverbal, we see this a lot, especially in Friends. When you look at Ross, the way he communicates nonverbally, it's funny, but it really helps us better understand what he's thinking because his words usually don't match his nonverbal. But when they do, we see those people as being more trustworthy, and we're more likely to believe what they say. Nonverbal messages, again, when you look at eye contact, you want to not avoid it, and you don't want to stare too long. For facial expressions, how can you tell if it's a real smile or a fake smile? If you look at this, this is a fake smile. The way you can tell is when the crow's feet on the corner of the eyes are there, you know it's a real smile. Some of our different gestures. The other thing is invading people's space has an impact on nonverbal and whether people are going to be receptive or not. Who's responsible for effective communication? Senders and receivers. So when we are sending a message, we have to make sure that we are asking, explaining, checking, using and observing body language. For the receiver, you need to listen, question, understand, and so both need to be active participants or it's not going to work. So how can we improve our personal communication? Here are some clues on sending clear messages. Try to avoid slang, jargon, complex words or terms that may be general Don't use slang or jargon or maybe words or terms that people aren't familiar with. Repetition. Make sure that we repeat ourselves, and I'm not saying 10, 15 times, but make sure you repeat yourself several times, especially the most important information to get it across. We have to make sure that we ask questions to clarify to make sure that the receiver is understanding this. The other thing is appropriate timing. If you want to have a conversation with your boss or with whoever, show you're interested and you're invested by asking, is this a good time to talk? If not, when would be a good time to talk? The other thing is kind of keep in mind what the receiver most would like in terms of what kind of communication. Some people may want an email. Some people may want face-to-face. Some people may want over the telephone. So really, again, paying attention to and getting in tune to what others want. For effective listening skills, keep in mind that hearing people and listening to people are two different things. You can hear what your parents say, but that doesn't mean you follow through and listen to what they say. So kind of keep that in mind. If you catch yourself thinking about what to say next, you're not doing a very good job of listening. And so I notice myself doing that a lot, and I have to stop thinking about what I want to say and tune back into the conversation and then purposefully kind of ask follow-up questions to keep myself engaged in what the other person is saying. When we look at active listening and some of the things that we need to do is make sure that you dig deeper into what that person is saying. Again, that's what's important about good follow-up questions. Critical listening, see things from the speaker's point of view, listen for what kind of evidence and analyze the credibility of what that person is saying. Empathic listening, walk in their moccasins, put themselves in your shoes, avoid judgment. Really acknowledge that you understand what it is that they're saying. And a lot of times you can do that by saying something like, from what I'm hearing, you're telling me, and then repeat it back and see if that's right or not. And most of all, be patient, So take your time, be invested, and really try and get yourself tuned into what those other people are doing and saying and communicating. So some of the different ways that communication happens in organizations. You have horizontal communications, which goes across levels. So in this case, an assistant principal talking to another assistant principal is horizontal. Co-workers talking back and forth is horizontal. Vertical is from bottom up or top down. So manager to another manager to a cashier, the boss to a manager to an employee would be examples of vertical communication. And then a lot of times this happens cross-functional. So that means it doesn't just flow horizontally or vertically. It flows both horizontally and vertically, which is what happens in most cases. You also have, when you look at improving upward communication, so like from employees to bosses, most communication happens down the chain. Upward doesn't happen nearly as much. And if you really want to develop or be a part of a company or a business that has a lot of trust, you need to have that upward communication where employees are able to go to managers and are able to go to bosses and communicate effectively. So when we look at communicating in a digital world, one of the things that we see is that we're doing more and more networking across the country, across the world, in other parts. And the other thing that we're starting to see is this growth of working virtually, that people are working from home. So when we look at some of the advantages of that, one is it's very cost effective because if you don't have to hire janitors to clean office buildings, it's more cost effective. Time is more effective because you have employees that can then work anytime, anywhere, So it really gives a lot of flexibility. And with the world of globalization, It doesn't make it very practical to try and have a company-wide meeting where everybody is in the same place at the same time, because it's expensive to fly people maybe from Europe to the Americas or Americas to India or wherever it might be. Um, but with those advantages come some disadvantages too, because sometimes you have breakdowns of communication because of this. The other thing is we have social media, um, where consumers are generating media, and that is kind of changing, you know, the dynamic of things. For employees, it really creates this need where if they're being on social media, their writing needs to be extremely clear, concise, has to follow rules of etiquette, has to observe rules of privacy and security. And so there's a whole new set of issues and problems that are taking place because of this digital world. When we look at mobile communication, this can be anyone, anywhere, anytime, however we want. Some things to kind of keep in mind is when is that time and place and person and method appropriate, and when is it not appropriate? The difference between messaging people and work-related, whether it be email or text. You need to be aware of what is the company's policy for personal use of mobile communications. You know, are you supposed to be tweeting or posting on Facebook during work? The inappropriate tweets and posts that can come back to bite you. What are the policies for bringing your own devices to work? And then for voicemail etiquette. So in regards to voicemail etiquette, imagine that you are calling George Costanza to ask him to interview for a job, and this is what you get.
Believe it or not, George isn't at home. Please leave a message at the beep. I must be out, or I'd pick up the phone. Where could I be? Believe it or not, I'm not home.
Email. Make sure you know the company's policies. I put Trilog 9 on there because when we first had graduated from school, one of my friends that worked at a Trilog company, he and several of his friends were sharing jokes. The problem is that email got forwarded to the wrong person, and out of the 9, I think 7 of them got fired. And so you really have to be aware of that. Using appropriate email addresses. Make sure you create a descriptive subject line, because that way people can prioritize messages. And so these are all some of the different things that you need to be aware of. One of the biggest problems with email is you miss the nonverbal cues, and that can kind of help. But when you look at emoticons, yeah, they can help, but it's not exactly the same. So if you're looking for some more, look at figure 2.4 on page 42, and that'll give you some more ideas. When we look at blogs, these are good ways to build career and personal brands, but you need to be aware of how do I do that. And these blogs can really help kind of further your career by selling yourself and selling your ideas. And so there's all kinds of materials out there on how you can define your personal brand, how you build your personal brand, and how you can put it to good use. One of the other things that I just saw and read an article on Wall Street Journal from August of 2019, more and more companies are seeing resumes that look like they were made more for Instagram or Twitter than they are for trying to sell themselves in the world of work. So make sure that when you're doing a resume, don't feel free to throw in a Bitmoji or an emoticon. You really want to make sure that you're staying professional, you're staying concise, and that you are selling and building your brand on doing that.